Fantastic. Hello. Thank you for joining us again to talk about equity in data. And my name is Heather Kraus. I am the founder of We All Count, which is a project for equity in data science. And the work that my team and I and our community all do is to think about how to embed data equity in all of the research and evaluation and learning agendas and business intelligence that we work on. And essentially, We All Count came to be, and the materials we're going to talk about today came into being after years and years and years of working in the data science sector for mission-driven organizations, and realizing that this idea that was kind of commonly held that data is objective, quantitative data especially is objective, and that evidence is free from a worldview is really, really problematic. And in fact, not the case that every aspect of quantitative data is embedded with some kind of a worldview. And it's essential that we find a way to make the biases and the worldviews that are embedded into research and evidence and evaluations transparent and aligned with our equity goals. And that's the purpose of the data equity framework. If you were here before, you've heard a little bit about the data equity framework, and you're going to have access to lots more tools and resources about the whole data equity framework, which is 7 steps from funding to motivation to project design, data collection, analysis, interpretation, and communication distribution. 7 steps of the knowledge generation and knowledge dissemination pipeline that each are directly connected to how much equity is embedded into the data project or evaluation or research or learning agenda. Excuse me. And the purpose of the data equity framework, is to make sure that you have a system where there's processes and checklists and tools that you can use wherever you find yourself in a data project. And as I said, later today, you'll have access to all kinds of resources dealing with each of the 7 steps. In our hour today, we're going to be talking about step 4, which is data collection, and step 6, which is interpretation. And we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into those 2 steps and how you can use some of the tools that we have in these 2 steps directly to start making a difference in the amount of equity that's in your research and in your work. So the tools for data collection and sourcing involve thinking about social construct data, which is another word for demographic data, and crafting a plan for how you're going to collect them, how you're going to think about them, and how you're going to use them, as well as learning about what is a data biography. So let's get started with those 2. And when we think about demographics or social constructs, sometimes they're also called social identity data. These are things like ethnicity, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status. These things are getting a great deal of attention in the way that we think about, frame, and understand education data. And that's very, very good that we're thinking about these things. And when we're learning how to collect them, it's also really important to think about how are we going to use them. Disaggregating data is essential when we want to understand what's actually going on for different types of students, different types of parents, different types of teachers, different types of communities. Disaggregating data is essential. And disaggregating data means being able to kind of pull apart your data by different social identities. However, simply disaggregating data for disaggregation's sake can lead to very serious equity problems. So this is why we need to think about why it is that we are disaggregating the data. How are we going to actually use the social identity data? Simply having somebody's gender or having somebody's race or ethnicity does not actually embed equity. How you use it is going to be what increases the equity in your research or in your knowledge generation. And using it correctly can really help, and using it incorrectly can accidentally lead to very serious equity problems. So essentially, when we're using demographics or social identity data, there's usually three main reasons that we want to disaggregate this data: intersectionality, proxies, and sample size. So let me take a minute to talk about what those three things actually mean. Intersectionality is when we want to look at data that's disaggregated by more than one social identity. And the idea behind intersectionality was developed by a very brilliant researcher, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And she helped us see that absolutely do different social identities have relationships with different amounts of marginalization or disparate effects. But the combination of several social identities can have a much stronger effect. So one of the reasons that we might want to disaggregate data is to be able to look at results or outcomes or student progress or school progress intersectionally. So one of the really common things to do is to combine the social identities of gender and race. Now, in this example, I have reduced gender and race to only two things: male, female, and black and white. Now, absolutely, of course, I understand that neither of these represent the full spectrum of social identity. I'm simply using these two binary definitions as an example in this case to keep it simple enough as a starter example. So if we were to wonder what % of our students have access to adequate academic support, we might want to disaggregate that by gender. And then we might see that male students, 89% of them have access to adequate academic support, and 71% of female students have access to academic support. Now that's a way of disaggregating that's probably very useful. We can do the same thing here for students by race. And we can see Black students, 87% of Black students have access to adequate academic support, and white students, 76% have access to adequate academic support in this particular school board. And so that is looking at disaggregated data by one social identity at a time. If we really want to think deeply about equity, we probably want to look at it intersectionally, which means looking at two identities at the same time. And so this right here, these bottom four sentences are disaggregating social identities so we can look at something intersectionally. And in the math of this, what it means is we're multiplying in the formulas that are used to create these numbers. You actually have a multiplication symbol rather than a plus symbol. And the results we get are very different because it shows the cumulative effects of disparate impact. So you can see that the outcomes here are very different than the outcomes here. That Black male students, white male students, Black female students, and white female students all are having very different experiences. And the true nuance and variation of these experiences is a little bit hidden when we only look at one dimension at a time. So reason number one that you might want to use disaggregated data is to be able to look at something intersectionally, to multiply the impacts of several identities at once. That's intersectionality. Second reason that you might want to bother with social constructs or demographic data, how that might help you embed equity into your research, is because you need to use this as a proxy. So proxies can be extremely helpful in rooting out and correcting injustice or oppression or inequity, but proxies can also be very, very problematic at accidentally reproducing structural racism, classism, sexism, the rest. So there's usually 4 reasons that you use a social identity piece of data as a proxy. Number 1, it's the only data you have. Number 2, you're trying to, okay, yeah, let's pretend we're going to use race as a proxy. So we're going to collect data about a student's race. And we're going to use this data about race in order to do an analysis that includes a student's race and the effect that it's having on their outcome. There's 4 reasons that we're going to want to use this proxy, race as a proxy. First reason is it's the only data we have. It's the only thing that whoever collected the data about students actually has. Second reason that we might want to use race as a proxy is that we're actually trying to understand the effect that race is having on a trend or an experience. Third reason is we're trying to talk not about race, but about racism. So that's not the effect of race, that's the effect of racism, which is very different. And lastly, you might be trying to show that race itself is having a biological cause for some kind of outcome. So we're going to pause now and ask on this slide, ask in the chat, what proxies do you use for collecting data as it relates to student subgroups? So we're asking you to put that into the chat. So, if you want to have an understanding about the students in your school or in your district or in your state, and you're collecting data about these students, what proxies do you use for collecting data as it relates to student subgroups? We're asking you to think about this, and if you feel so moved, put some of your responses in the chat. So ethnicities, gender, and then 2 things which I do not know. SWD. What is SWD?
Students with disabilities and
okay,
free and reduced lunch.
Interesting. Oh, okay, that's super cool. Okay. Free and reduced lunch is a very, very good example of a proxy. Special education status, gender, race, EL. What's EL? Is that English language? Yes?
Yes. English learners, yes.
English learners. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Oh, these are fantastic. Okay, this is exactly. So these are great examples of proxies that you are collecting. And very few students, if any, are born with checkboxes on their bellies as little babies that tells you whether they're these things, right? These things are ways that we have decided we're going to sort people. They're things that we constructed. And sometimes we want to collect and use this type of data because we want to understand what's going on. Sometimes it's the only data we have. If the only data we have, for example, is race and gender data, we might do an analysis about like how student outcomes are related to race and gender, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the findings that we will have about something being caused, for example, by race, means that it's actually related to race. In your example, it could very much be related to free and reduced lunch status, but because for whatever reason, this school board doesn't have that data, we can only analyze it by race. And by doing that, we're using race as a proxy for free and reduced lunch by accident. And we'll think we're getting information about race and how it reflects on outcomes, when in fact, we're accidentally not. Second reason, and this is really, really important. This is probably the most important reason that we actually, the next two work together. You're trying to understand the effect that race is having on a trend or experience. So let's say you do have data that shows that different races are experiencing something differently in your school board. It seems logical to say that. School district data that shows that children of color are on average getting lower test scores than white children. It's not inherently incorrect to say this. What's important is how you say it. If we have data that shows that children of color are getting lower test scores, then race is a proxy. There's nothing about race that's directly causing these lower test scores. So it's important to make it very clear in any communication that you do that race is not causing lower test scores, or you'll be accidentally using equity-based data that you collected to try and illustrate problems. You'll be accidentally replicating stereotypes. Third, when you're trying to talk about racism. So this is probably the reason that we want to collect the race data. We want to include a race variable in our data project because we want to highlight the effects and impacts of racism. But this, however, is another case where it's very tricky to use this demographic data. By using race as a proxy for racism, we accidentally place the locus of power sometimes in the wrong place. Also, if we use race as a proxy, we might mathematically homogenize the experience of an entire group of diverse people, which is, of course, almost the definition of racism. So we're going to talk about that in a very specific example in just a minute about mathematically homogenizing people, clumping people together. So the fourth reason that we might want to use a social identity variable like race in an analysis is that you're trying to show that race itself actually causes something. When you're doing this, then this is the only case that race is no longer being used as a proxy. This is almost never the case in educational research. It is occasionally the case in medical studies, where you're actually testing how a medication might be metabolized or how a certain disease might need to be treated in different biological groups, but it's rare. So what we're trying to talk about is it's not enough to think that you're embedding equity by collecting social identity or demographic data. You need to think about why you're collecting it and how you're going to actually use it. Intersectionality is using social construct data so you can look at the disaggregated accumulation of effects. Proxies is when you have demographic data that you're either using to understand the experience of a group of people that might have a social identity in common, or when you're trying to understand the effects of the actual marginalization or oppression that is occurring to people with a social identity. And then the third reason you might use it is it's the only data you have. And in that case, you need to be extremely careful. The third thing that we're going to talk about collecting very nuanced data with an intention to embed equity in your work, collecting nuanced, inclusive demographic data, is that this then leaves us with a question of exactly how are we going to analyze it if we have a small sample size. Let's say that you're looking at an educational service unit and administering a survey to parents of high school students interested in the differences in parent perceptions for parents who have students with disabilities and parents who have students without disabilities. Let's say that you decide to include the terms of the NSSRS used to classify the disabilities in a question about whether the student has a disability. So instead of asking like a yes or no, you're going to list many options: emotional disturbance, deaf blindness, hearing impaired, multiple impairments, orthopedic impairments, all the other things that are included in that official classification. And the reason for asking really nuanced, inclusive questions like this in surveys, whether it's about disability status, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration history, there's all kinds of different ways that with really good equity intentions, you might want to ask very inclusive, nuanced questions rather than just a binary yes or no question around social identity data. When you do this, you almost always have a few categories where you get very few responses. And what are you going to do with this? How are you going to make meaning from these very, very small response categories? Are you going to aggregate it, or are you not going to aggregate it? You do have the option of collapsing the data. So in our example, where we're using an inclusive, nuanced list of possible differently abled students, let's say that 3 of them, let's say deaf blindness, autism, and traumatic brain injury. I am not speaking from experience on these particular types of data. I'm just saying, let's say that deaf blindness, autism, and traumatic brain injury all have very, very small numbers of responses in those categories. What are we going to do? Are we going to collapse that data into 2 giant binary sectors, one called not disabled and one called disabled, and just analyze our survey like that and report out in 2 boxes? That's an option, fairly common option, but the problem is that you are immediately taking people's nuanced, inclusive answers and sorting them right back into the not disabled and disabled boxes. Or even if you get the wording maybe to be more inclusive around differently abled, either way, you're still taking a lot of nuanced information that you've asked somebody to share with you, personal sensitive information that you've asked somebody to share with you, and kind of putting it into a very big bucket. This diminishes trust almost immediately with the group of people that you are probably trying to establish trust with when you ask the inclusive question. The other thing, though, to point out is that beyond emotions or feelings, this is a mathematically weak option. Because the reason that we are even concerned with how to analyze this data is that some of the data is very small samples. And we in theory are trying to get the sample size to be bigger so that we can have a more reliable answer. That's the purpose of collapsing data from a mathematical point of view. Problem here is that if you collapse data from a lot of really different subsets of people that aren't actually related in the way that they answered the questions, you might have a bigger sample size, but your response and your results are much less reliable. So for example, by taking the small sample size of students who identified as having autism, or students that identified as having deaf blindness, or students that identified as traumatic brain injury, and clumping them all together in a way that homogenizes them, that says these people are all going to be in a box because they're similar. The chances of the responses to all the other survey questions, which is what you're trying to get information about, like the attitude, the parent experience questions of these 3 subcategories, are not going to be the same, because they are not the same. And so in your attempt to get a more reliable answer by getting a bigger sample size, you're actually ending up with a much less reliable answer. So another option is not collapsing and simply reporting the findings for the very small sample sizes that you have. Now, I'm assuming here that privacy is not a problem, that your numbers are at least big enough, or the numbers are from a broad enough community that you're not going to identify a single individual. We can talk about that another time if that is your issue. But assuming that if you're collecting statewide data or even district-wide data, it's going to be okay to report out on nuanced, inclusive categories that you collected. What you need to do at this point then is to report confidence intervals. And a confidence interval is like the plus or minus. So this will give the consumers of your research and your knowledge a very accurate understanding of how much information you have about each one of these parents. So if, say half of your parents said their students had no disability at all, and the main question of interest is like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good is your experience at your child's school? And we'd say maybe these parents would say on a scale of 1 to 10, in average, we give it a 6, plus or minus 1. And that would plus or minus 1 is the confidence interval of the parents who have students without disabilities. And one of our really small groups was parents who have children with traumatic brain injury, and we have a much smaller sample size. We can still report out information about that. We just need to say a confidence interval. So in other words, we would say for parents with a child who has traumatic brain injury, on a scale of 1 to 10, their feelings of happiness with their school is a 7, plus or minus 3. So that still gives you information about that specific group without having to collapse them into a group with a whole bunch of other people that they might not be similar to. But it does a little bit weaken the voice of the smallest group because we do have less precise information about the smaller groups. So what we suggest you do is decide on how to deal with this before distributing your data collection tool and before your analysis. And the reason we suggest that is so that you can be transparent about what you're going to do. So if we stay with our example and we're collecting a survey from parents, and one of the questions is disability status of your child, accompanying that question will be the list of options that we're giving them, the choices, and a sentence or two about how exactly we're going to use this. If we are going to collapse the data into has a disability or doesn't have a disability, we should say that in a sentence so that the sensitive personal information that you're asking someone to share with you can be made with equal power between you and them. And that's one way to make sure there's equity in your data, rather than you ask them sensitive information and then you decide what to do with it. And we also want to point out that there are no statistical problems with reporting your results in more than one way: aggregated, unaggregated, collapsed, uncollapsed. That is not p-hacking or results fishing. Taking the data you have and reporting it in more than one way, clearly documenting what you did and why, is very scientifically robust. There's no problem with that. And we actually recommend that you do that, because that's kind of a best of both worlds. The things you should stop doing around how to analyze this demographic data, especially with small sample sizes, is stop using the word other. I think most of you are already on that from our discussions. There are much better terms for combined or catch-all categories that don't have kind of dehumanizing connotations. Secondly, though, which is less commonly known, don't discount small sample sizes with the words "not statistically significant." That's actually a technically incorrect word, and it also puts the onus on the people whose data you're choosing not to report. Just because you have a wide confidence interval does not indicate that the data doesn't have meaning. It isn't statistically insignificant. And if you do want to suppress data, it's usually best to use some kind of a phrasing that puts the onus on the research department or the research body or the decision-making body rather than on the people themselves. So saying, we chose not to collect enough data to give you a reliable estimate is way better than saying people with children with this kind of disability are not statistically significant. And we have a lot more, we're working on this particular problem quite actively right now, and we have several other pieces of research you can read if you're interested. Okay, so the second thing we're going to talk about in the data collection phase, remember we're talking about step 4, which is data collection, is how to think about and make a data biography. And a data biography is exactly what it sounds like, a history of your data. If you know the term metadata, it's kind of like metadata, but much more nuanced, much more in-depth, and with attentiveness to equity. And a data biography is essentially the when, what, who, why, how, and where of the history of your data. Where did it come from? Who created it? Why did they create it? Who's included? Who isn't included? All the different ways that you can understand what worldviews are already embedded in this data when it's coming to you. And one example that really drove this home for me is I used to do a lot of work, or still do a lot of work, in the intimate partner violence research world. And I was at a very fancy conference with some very prestigious organizations. And one of these very well-funded, famous organizations put up this chart talking about violence rates in different countries. And I was working with a lot of this data, and I knew immediately that this chart was incorrect, and that these data sets were not comparable. Some of these data sets included people of different ages. Some of these data sets were self-reported incidents of violence. Some of these data sets were based solely on police reports of violence. Some of these were based on asking survey takers had they experienced violence. And these were absolutely not comparable data points. And so we went in and we made a data biography to understand exactly what was embedded in each one of these data sets so that we could identify equity issues and actually fix them, so that we made a new chart that compared apples to apples rather than all these other kinds of fruit to all these other kinds of fruit. And one reason that this is an equity issue is it helps you understand what viewpoints are embedded. And secondly, it helps you catch things that you might not otherwise catch. One of the reasons I think this chart that got through so many editors and so many proofreaders that actually knew better, is that it confirmed an unconscious racial bias that countries with more Black women had higher rates of violence, which is not necessarily true once you make a data biography. Data biographies are really important in education because of how much worldviews are embedded into the data we collect about students and schools and outcomes. It's real for me to see things like this, count of students by race. Nowhere, I have clicked on everything on this website. Nowhere does it tell me how these students were assigned to a race. Did these students choose this race themselves? Did their parents provide a racial identity? Is it taken from some government administrative database?
Hey, Heather, I think we're losing you.
Points of view being about, I would be very, very hesitant to make decisions. to a different one, so we should be okay. All right, so that is what we're going to talk about today for data collection and sourcing. And what we're going to talk about now is interpretation, and we're going to do some interactive work about interpretation. Interpretation is a very important step of research and knowledge generation that's often overlooked. And it has very, very important equity implications. I'm going to tell you one example, not in the education sector, but an important example, which is there's this algorithm called the COMPAS algorithm. And the COMPAS algorithm gives a score that predicts how likely it is that this person will reoffend. And this algorithm is used in several jurisdictions to help judges and other officers of the court decide who should get bail, who should get parole, things like this. And a group of very, very smart investigative journalists did some work and were able to show that when you fed data from very similar people into this algorithm, it gave consistently higher risk scores to people whose skin was darker. This is very clearly an equity problem. And it started a bunch of conversations about algorithmic accountability and machine learning, all of which are very important. However, if you're not a machine learning person, this illustrates the problem with interpretation. It is true that the COMPAS algorithm gives you a number. It is not true. It is not a correct interpretation that the COMPAS algorithm gives you a score that predicts how likely it is that this person will reoffend. That is an incorrect interpretation. The correct interpretation is that the COMPAS algorithm gives you a score that predicts how likely it is that this person might be in contact with the police again, be arrested by those police again, and not have the money for immediate bail release. So you can immediately see how a more accurate representation gives you a very different equity perspective on how you might use this research. And in the production of your research or knowledge or evaluation, it's vital that you think about how you take the results, and the results are numbers that are coming out at the end of your analysis stage. You take the numbers, which are results, and you walk them across a bridge. And you walk them across a bridge to an interpretation. And as we've just seen, interpretation is a meaning and a narrative to explain the number. So in the COMPAS example, the result is the score, just a number that comes out of the algorithm. The interpretation is the meaning and narrative that they put around that number. Is that correct interpretation of that number, how likely they are to reoffend, or is the correct interpretation of that number how likely they are to be in contact with the police again and have the police do their thing? So how do you know that something is an interpretation, a good, supportable, equitable interpretation? Is what happens when you walk it across this bridge. You look at your project design, you look at your methodology, you look at all the things that went into generating this result and see if it's an interpretation that you would like to make a decision based on, that you would trust. Now, we are very unused to, we're very out of practice as humans, as consumers of data, as producers of research. We're out of practice at looking at any sentence and asking ourselves, is this a result or is this an interpretation? And from an equity perspective, being able to tell whether you're looking at a result or an interpretation is an essential skill. So we're just going to spend a couple of minutes playing a little quiz game that tests this exact skill. We're going to do a really shortened version here, But we have a much longer version on our website if this is your thing. You can entertain yourself. So we're going to do this by a poll. 85% of our respondents reported feeling happier on the days when they had eaten breakfast. Do you think that that's a result or an interpretation? And there's a poll for you to take your best guess. And this isn't a quiz that you're going to get graded on. This is just practice and getting your mind to ask the question. Okay, so the votes are in, and 80% of you said this was a result. 20% of you said this was an interpretation. Ah, good, she's sharing. Thank you for sharing. I tried to share, it didn't work. So this is a tricky one. I will say this is a very tricky one, and it's hard to get this without some broader context. So I think that this is a result. I, of course, had the broader context than you. And this, in fact, does only state the exact result from a specific question. So in this research, we asked, do you feel happier on the days you had eaten breakfast? And 85% of the people checked yes. This is a result because it doesn't try and say why breakfast made anybody happier. And it only addresses the people that were directly asked. 85% of our respondents. Okay, next quiz question. Eating breakfast will make you happier. Result or interpretation? Oh, you guys got so fast. I'm stopping saying guys. I know I said this last time. You folks have gotten fast. All right, we're sharing. Okay, so vast majority think that this is an interpretation, and I would agree. I think that this is an interpretation of the results from the previous question. And it has taken the results, those quantitative numbers that come out of an analysis, and walked them across the bridge of the project design, the methodology, the type of research question, and told a story, made them into an interpretation. And the reason that I think you can tell that this is an interpretation is that we're no longer just talking about the people in our study. We said our respondents felt. Now we're saying you. So we're no longer talking about the people in our study. We're extrapolating to a lot more people, and we're making a causal claim. We're saying eating breakfast will make you happier. That's a causal claim, and it's very, very important to be able to identify when people are making a causal claim, and that is pretty much always an interpretation. And if you see an interpretation, interpretations aren't bad. That's not a sign of like, oh, something's gone wrong. Interpretations are an important part of knowledge generation. It's essential that we make meaning of our results, especially because we understand kind of what went into the results. So having something be an interpretation is not problematic. Being confused about whether it's a result or an interpretation is what's problematic. Okay, another quiz question. Our study shows that being Black puts you at the highest risk for adult illiteracy. Result or interpretation? All right. So I would also think, similar to most of you, that this is an interpretation. And this is probably the most important example in terms of why being able to tell the difference between a result and interpretation is really important in terms of equity. So it's very possible that the result here is that the count of Black people with literacy challenges might be higher than the count of not Black people with literacy challenges. But the meaning inferred from this result is presented here with a very specific perspective that tips you off to the fact that it's an interpretation. And anytime you ask, is this a result or an interpretation? And your answer is interpretation. The next thing that you want to ask is this interpretation supported? What worldview is embedded into this interpretation? And that allows you to decide, is this an interpretation I would trust? Is this an interpretation that I want to make policy based on or make decisions based on? And this is true in your educational research, this is true in your day-to-day lives. Anytime you see something that's an interpretation, it's great to pause and say, how did they walk it over the bridge? Because every interpretation is a result that's been walked over a bridge, and that bridge involves method, project design, and worldviews. And this one in particular, I really like because we got to see issues with interpretations like this play out in real time when we started getting COVID data. And this is very much related to what we talked about at the beginning of our time together today, where we talked about how careful we have to be if we're going to collect social identity data, how careful we need to be about how we're going to use it. Are we using it as a proxy for something? And if so, is that supported? So when we started seeing COVID data come out, first because it was a pandemic, it was an emergency, there was no social identity data collected. People were just trying to count cases and see, figure out what to do. Then people started demanding equity, and part of that in almost every data situation is to start collecting some social identity data. So around the world, specifically in Canada and the US, people started to collect race data so we could see what was going on with COVID and race. And in an attempt to be equitable, large, major, important news organizations started to put out headlines like, Black people more likely to get COVID, which is, of course, an interpretation of the racial disaggregation of COVID data, but it's not a supportable interpretation. There wasn't then, and there is not now, any research that shows that the color of your skin has anything to do with the probability of you getting COVID. There's no biology to support that. So Black people more likely to get COVID was a misuse of disaggregated data. And you saw the media get slammed for that pretty fast, and they 100% deserved it. So they tried to do better. And then they started to say things like Black communities disproportionately impacted by COVID. And so now we find ourselves in the part of using social identity data where we have to think, are we trying to talk about the effects of race, or are we trying to talk about the effects of racism? Black communities disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus is a well-intentioned headline. It's a better headline than Black people more likely to get COVID. But it's still using the Black social identity data as a proxy. This is because we do have research now, it's been a long time, don't we all know it's been a long time, that if there are two neighborhoods and neighborhood A is mostly people who identify as Black and neighborhood B is mostly people that identify as white, and both of these neighborhoods have access to the same quality and quantity of healthcare, and both of these neighborhoods have the same proportion of adults who have the opportunity and option to work from home. Those two neighborhoods are going to get COVID at the exact same rate. We have that data now. So when we say Black communities being disproportionately affected by COVID, we're using Black as a proxy for racism. Because really, the neighborhoods that are most likely to get COVID are not Black neighborhoods. They're neighborhoods that have that are experiencing oppression and marginalization. They don't have access to healthcare. They don't have the opportunity to work at home. So it is a very, very tricky thing to combine how to use social identity data and how to tell a story about a result. And you need to think, are you trying to talk about race and its effects, or are you trying to talk about racism and its effects? And race is not a racist example I'm using here because COVID data is a very straightforward example of that. But that is true of disability status. It is true of gender status. It is true of all of the other things that you all listed for me at the beginning, whether or not somebody has free lunch, whether or not somebody is an English learner. It's very important to collect this data, and it's even more important to be very, very careful about how we use that data and how we interpret, how we tell stories with that data. And the important message here is that it's critical. The first step is be aware when you are interpreting. Be aware that a result is different than an interpretation, and all results need to be walked across that bridge and made into an interpretation. And if you do that intentionally rather than subconsciously, you're much more likely to be meeting your equity goals, meeting your intentions to actually collect and use social identity data for equity rather than accidentally doubling down on the racism. And one of the reasons that sometimes people are hesitant to be really transparent about the fact that they're interpreting their results is that it feels like, well, then things are going to get squishy. People are going to say, I'm not certain that your results are real. But a strongly supported interpretation is much more powerful than hiding behind an unsupported claim that just science makes this objectively true. That's what's really squishy and isn't sustainable and isn't going to last very long. So with a few minutes to go, I have reached the end of today. I'm going to turn it back to some people who are going to share access to resources with you. But if you're interested in contacting me and our project directly for some support or for some more resources, weallcount.com is the project hub. Has lots of blog posts, free resources, videos you can watch. You can help us tell stories and build stories. We're 2021, we're doing interactive story building and case study building. And if you want to talk to me directly, support@weallcount.com is email. And you all also have access to our online learning platform that has these slides other slides and some tools and resources. That platform is down today. We're having some server issues, but I'll make sure that you all have a link that you can use to register as soon as that platform is back up. And I should say that platform is not an upsell, like it's free. We don't collect data, we don't sell your data. It's just a curated private space where people involved in the project can talk about equity. It's not a a secret Facebook or anything. Okay, so someone's going to share a link now, right?
Someone is not going to share a link now, since you did mention that the site was down. So
Heather, isn't there an evaluation link?
Oh, so Betsy did put the evaluation link in the chat. Right. So thank you again for participating in today's survey. We want your feedback as always. We placed a very brief evaluation survey in the chat. It'll take less than 3 minutes. We look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn on Wednesday, February 17th from 12 to 1 Central to unpack the multitude of resources that have been shared with us by Heather. So in the coming days, you'll receive an email from me with a link and an overview of the resources that goes through all of the steps of the foundations of data equity and the data equity framework. And there's some supplemental materials that we can unpack to discuss how to use our data with the equity lens and how to overcome some, latent biases that we all may have.
Yay.
So thank you so much to Heather, and we all count. And we will also see you at our next learning community on the ESSA tiers of evidence that will be featuring REL Central and some of our wonderful folks from Nebraska NTSS on Thursday, March 4th from 3:30 to 4:30. Thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you, Heather. These presentations have been wonderful and insightful. We really appreciate you.
I really appreciate the invitation. I really enjoy this group of people.